Okay, so you ready to dive in?
Oh, absolutely. Always ready for a deep dive.
Awesome. So today we are taking a look at a bunch of stuff about the high Arctic, polar regions, all that good stuff.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and you guys sent us some really interesting stuff this time around, so I'm excited to get into it. Like, we've got material here about ancient geology, like secrets hidden in the rocks and stuff,
Oh, wow.
and also about how crazy creatures survive in these just unbelievably icy
I
places.
mean, that's always fascinating, right? How life finds a way.
Totally. And there are even some like super intense stories about humans pushing themselves to the absolute limit in the cold and isolation.
Ooh, I bet those are pretty gripping. Can't wait to hear those.
Yeah, they are pretty wild. So I guess what we're really trying to do today is figure out how life manages to hang on in places that seem like totally impossible to live in.
Yeah, like what are the tricks? What are the adaptations that make it possible?
Exactly. And, maybe see if there are any lessons we can learn from all of this, for ourselves.
I'm sure there are. Nature is full of surprises, right?
Right.
Always something new to discover.
Definitely. Okay, so to kick things off, let's picture this place in Greenland.
Okay, I'm listening.
So it's a valley, and your notes describe it as like mostly brown sandstone, all carved up by glaciers, and the temperature swings there are absolutely insane.
Insane in what way?
Like it'll be baking hot under the summer sun, and then suddenly it's plunged into total darkness and freezing cold for winter.
Oh, wow. So extremes, huh?
Total extremes. It's a polar desert, too.
Really? I didn't know deserts could be polar.
Right, but apparently it's super dry with constant wind ripping through it. Not exactly what you picture when you think of a lush paradise, right?
Definitely not. Sounds pretty brutal, actually.
Yeah, it does. So you wouldn't think much could survive there, would you?
I mean, based on that description, I'd say not much at all. It sounds pretty barren.
But here's the thing. Buried in those rocks is a crazy history. We're talking fossils that are like 200 million years old.
Wait, 200 million? That's a long time ago.
Right. And these aren't just any fossils. We're talking dinosaurs, turtles, amphibian stuff that lived in warm tropical places.
Huh. That is strange. You'd think. I don't know, wouldn't you think they'd be fossils of, like, Ice Age creatures or something if it's so cold there now?
You would, but nope, it's tropical stuff. It's like a giant reminder that the planet has changed so much over time.
Yeah, totally. It's mind-blowing to think about the history of our planet, like how different it used to be.
Right. So that begs the question, if it was once a tropical paradise, how does anything survive there now?
Yeah, good question. What's the secret?
Well, it seems like the trick is to stay close to the ground, like really close.
Huh, interesting. Like down in the dirt.
Basically, there's a whole world going on just inches above the frozen soil, and that's where the action is.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So take the Arctic willow, for example. Willows are usually these graceful trees with branches that kind of droop down, right?
Yeah, I can picture that.
Well, the Arctic willow is completely different. It grows sideways, almost hugging the ground, like it's trying to stay out of the wind as much as possible.
That makes sense. If the wind is that strong, I guess staying low is your best bet.
Totally. And its branches and roots, they weave through cracks in the rocks and these little thawed patches, and they can stretch for like 30 feet.
30 feet. Wow, that's pretty impressive for a plant that's hugging the ground.
Right. And get this, they found one that was over 200 years old.
200 years. So this little plant has been hanging out there since, I don't even know, like the early 1800s?
Something like that. It's crazy to think about.
That's amazing. It's seen a lot of changes, I bet.
For sure. And it's not just about staying out of the wind. Those shallow roots, they're perfect for grabbing nutrients in the short time the ground thaws. And it has tiny hairs on its leaves for protection from the elements.
It's like this plant is perfectly designed for this harsh environment.
It really is. And here's another cool thing. All these low-growing plants actually help create the tundra, which is this spongy layer of moss and grasses.
Oh, right. Tundra. I've heard of that. Isn't that like frozen ground most of the time?
Yeah, but the top layer thaws out in the summer, and even though it's thin, it makes a huge difference for life.
How so?
Well, it acts like a little shelter. Your notes mention this crazy gale in 2002 where tents just a foot or two off the ground were completely ripped apart.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
Right. But down in the tundra, it was calm, and there were even insects buzzing around like nothing was happening.
Wow. That's amazing. It's like a whole different world down there.
It really is. Okay, so speaking of creatures that are perfectly adapted to this ground-level life, have you heard of the Arctic woolly bear caterpillar?
Woolly bear caterpillar. I don't think so. What's that?
So it's this tiny caterpillar, like only an inch long, and it's covered in these fuzzy hairs.
Okay, sounds cute.
It is kind of cute, but there's this story in your notes where someone, I think his name was Bill, was about to set up camp, and he freaked out when he saw one of these caterpillars.
Really? Why? Did it bite him or something?
No, nothing like that. It's just that these caterpillars have this, like, ridiculously long life cycle.
Oh. How long are we talking?
Okay, so they only actively feed for a short time in July.
July. That's not a very long time to eat.
Nope, but they spend the rest of the year frozen solid.
Frozen solid? Like a popsicle?
Basically. And then they thaw out in June, eat some more, and then freeze again. This can go on for, get this, 7 to 15 years.
Wait, 7 to 15 years? That's crazy.
I know. So all that time, they're just waiting to become a moth, which they only get to be for like 2 weeks.
2 weeks? After all that time? Man, that's rough.
I know, right? So you can kind of see why Bill might not want to accidentally squish something that had been waiting that long to become a moth.
Yeah, I get it. Poor little guy. But how does it even survive being frozen solid? Wouldn't the ice, like, destroy its cells?
That's what I was wondering. But apparently they have this incredible adaptation. They produce their own antifreeze.
Antifreeze, like what we put in our cars.
Kind of. It's a natural cryoprotectant, which basically means it prevents them from freezing solid at the cellular level.
That's amazing. Nature's so resourceful.
It really is. So they can survive temperatures down to like minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit.
Minus 70. Geez, that's cold. I wouldn't last 5 minutes out there.
Me neither. Okay, so changing gears a bit, you sent in this incredible story about a woman named Anna Bogenholm.
Anna Bogenholm.
Yeah.
Does that name ring a bell?
Well, she was a doctor who had this really bad skiing accident. She ended up submerged in freezing water for over an hour.
Over an hour. In freezing water? That sounds awful.
It was. By the time they rescued her, she had no pulse. Her pupils were dilated. Basically, all signs pointed to her being dead.
Oh, wow. I don't even know what to say.
It's a pretty intense story, but here's the incredible part. Because she was so cold, her body's metabolic rate had slowed down so much that her brain was able to survive without oxygen for much longer than normal.
So the cold actually protected her brain. That's wild.
I know, right? And the doctors, they slowly warmed her blood back up using a heart-lung machine, and she actually recovered.
Really? She made a full recovery.
Well, not a full recovery, but a significant one. It's pretty amazing. They even have this saying now, you're not dead until you're warm and dead.
That's a good one. I'm going to have to remember that.
Yeah, it really highlights how extreme cold can have this weird, almost protective effect.
It makes you wonder, like, what are the limits of human survival, you know?
Totally. And speaking of surviving in freezing water, your notes also talk about this scientist, Arthur de Vries, who studied Antarctic fish.
Antarctic fish? What's so special about them?
Well, they live in water that's below the freezing point of fresh water.
But how is that possible? Shouldn't they be frozen solid?
Exactly. But it turns out they have these special proteins in their blood called antifreeze proteins.
Antifreeze proteins. So like the caterpillars.
Kind of. But these proteins work by binding to ice crystals and preventing them from growing bigger.
So they stop the ice from, like, basically stabbing the fish's cells.
Exactly. And the coolest part is how these proteins evolved. They actually came from a digestive protein that the fish already had.
Wait, so nature just kind of repurposed an existing protein? That's so efficient.
I know, right? It's amazing how evolution works. And these antifreeze proteins aren't just in fish either. They're found in a ton of polar organisms.
Like what?
Like insects, plants, even fungi. And someone even tried to make ice cream that never melts using antifreeze proteins from an eel.
Ice cream that never melts. That sounds kind of weird.
Yeah, it didn't really catch on. But it shows you the potential for these amazing adaptations.
Totally. So we talked about antifreeze, but your notes also mention another way to survive in the cold: desiccation.
Desiccation, isn't that like drying out?
Yep. It's basically getting rid of all the water in your body.
That sounds not very fun.
Maybe not for us, but for some creatures, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah.
Like certain roundworms, they produce this special sugar called trehalose.
Trehalose, what's that do?
It replaces the water in their cells, so when they dry out, their ticket structures don't get damaged. They basically go into this suspended animation, like hitting pause on their life.
So they're just like chilling out, waiting for better times.
Pretty much. And they can stay like that for years, even decades, until they get rehydrated. It's like a biological time machine.
That's insane. And it's not just worms either, right?
Nope. Tardigrades, those little water bears, can do it too. and some crustaceans, fungi, even single-celled organisms.
Wow, life is so much more resilient than I ever imagined. But what about creatures that don't have antifreeze or desiccation? How do they stay warm?
Good question. That's where good old-fashioned insulation comes in. Fur, feathers, nature's winter gear.
Like those musk oxen, right? They have those 2 layers of wool and that super soft undercoat, quivia.
Oh yeah, quivia. I've heard that's some of the warmest, softest stuff on Earth.
It's supposed to be incredible. And then there are polar bears with their thick fur. It looks white, but it's actually made of hollow hairs that scatter light.
Interesting. So it's more about trapping heat than being a certain color.
Exactly. And their skin is black underneath, so it absorbs heat from the sun really well.
That's clever. It's like they've got a built-in solar panel.
I know, right? And some animals, like penguins and seabirds, have this super cool system called countercurrent heat exchange.
Countercurrent heat exchange. That sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty simple. Basically, the arteries carrying warm blood down to their feet run right next to the veins carrying cold blood back up.
Okay, and?
So the warm blood loses some of its heat to the cold blood, warming it up before it reaches the body's core.
So it's like a little heat recycling system. That's brilliant.
Right. And then there are these general rules, like Bergman's rule, which says that animals in colder climates tend to be bigger.
Bigger. Why is that?
Because a bigger body means less surface area compared to its volume. And less surface area means less heat loss.
Ah, that makes sense. It's like those little hand warmers, right? The bigger they are, the longer they stay warm.
Exactly. And polar animals also tend to have shorter appendages, like ears and tails, for the same reason to minimize heat loss.
So they're basically all about conserving energy and staying warm.
Totally. And of course, they also use behavioral adaptations like huddling together for warmth.
Which makes sense. Sharing body heat is a classic survival strategy.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about the cold, but the polar environment has another challenge. The crazy light cycles.
Oh, right. Like the midnight sun and all that.
Yep. 24 hours of daylight in the summer and then total darkness in the winter. Your notes mention a musk ox just casually munching on plants at 2 a.m.
Like it was no big deal.
Exactly. But for humans, that kind of messed up light schedule can be a real problem.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It can mess with your sleep and stuff, right?
Totally. It disrupts our circadian rhythms, which are basically our internal clocks.
Right. Our body's natural rhythm. I remember reading about that. It won a Nobel Prize a few years back, right?
It did.
Yeah.
And messing with those rhythms can have a lot of negative health effects. Think about jet lag. It's basically the same thing.
Yeah, I hate jet lag. It takes me days to get back to normal.
But a lot of polar creatures can just turn off their internal clocks during the summer.
Like they just ignore it?
Pretty much. They're just like, food, food, food. Gotta eat as much as possible while the sun's up.
Makes sense. They've got to stock up for the winter.
Exactly. Okay, so even though the polar environment seems pretty harsh, your notes also talk about these little pockets of life, almost like oases.
Oases. In the Arctic. That's hard to imagine.
I know, but they're real. Like you'll be walking through this barren landscape and suddenly you come across this patch of bright green, teeming with life.
What causes that?
Well, sometimes it's something like a dead muskox.
A dead muskox. How does that create an oasis?
As the carcass decomposes, it releases all these nutrients into the soil, which is normally pretty nutrient poor.
So it's like a natural fertilizer.
Exactly. And then plants start growing like crazy, which attracts insects and other animals.
That's so cool. So even death can create life in these harsh environments.
It's a beautiful cycle, isn't it? And it's not just carcasses either. Even a big rock can become a little ecosystem.
A rock. How's that possible?
Well, birds like to perch on rocks, right? And their droppings, along with any leftover prey, create these nutrient-rich spots.
So it's like a mini compost pile on a rock.
Exactly. And then lichen starts to grow, and then other plants, and before you know it, you have a little oasis.
That's amazing. It's incredible how nature can create life in the most unexpected places.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked about how animals and plants survive in the poles, but what about humans?
Right. We're not exactly built for those kinds of conditions.
Nope. We evolved in warm climates with all these adaptations for getting rid of heat, like sweating.
And we've only been living in polar regions for a relatively short time, right?
Yeah. Yep. There's evidence of humans in Siberia as far back as 40,000 years ago. But the Inuit, who are probably the best adapted humans to the Arctic, they've only been there for about 4,000 years.
That's still a long time, but it's a blink of an eye compared to, like, polar bears and musk oxen.
Exactly. But the Inuit have developed some incredible technologies, diets, and cultural practices that allow them to thrive in those harsh conditions.
It's like their traditional high-fat diet, right? I've heard about that. It seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does. You'd think all that fat would be bad for their health.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
But it turns out they have some genetic adaptations that help them process those fats differently.
Really? That's fascinating. So evolution has helped them adapt to their environment, even on a genetic level.
Exactly. And these adaptations affect things like how they metabolize fats and their cholesterol levels.
So it's not just about their diet. Their bodies are actually different because of generations of living in that environment.
That's the amazing thing about evolution. It can work on so many different levels.
Totally. But what about when, like, a regular person like me goes into the cold? What happens to our bodies then?
Well, our bodies have some immediate responses to try and keep us warm.
Like what?
Well, first, we start shivering.
Oh, yeah. The chattering teeth. Not a very pleasant feeling.
No, but it's actually our muscles contracting to generate heat.
Oh, so it's like a built-in exercise routine.
Kind of. And then our blood vessels constrict, which pushes warm blood away from the surface of our skin and towards our core organs.
That makes sense. Protecting the vital organs is key.
Exactly. And we also get goosebumps.
Goosebumps. Those little bumps on your skin.
Yep. It's a leftover reflex from when we had more hair. The idea was to fluff up our fur to trap more heat.
Oh, so it's like a useless leftover from our hairier ancestors.
Pretty much. But fat plays a big role too, not just for insulation.
Right. I know fat keeps us warm, but does it do anything else?
Well, there's this type of fat called brown fat that's actually really good at generating heat.
Generating heat. How does it do that?
It has a lot of mitochondria, which are basically the powerhouses of our cells.
Oh, right. Mitochondria. I vaguely remember that from biology class.
So these mitochondria burn energy and create heat as a byproduct. It's like they're tiny furnaces in our bodies.
That's incredible. So our bodies can actually create their own heat.
Yep. And studies have shown that exposure to cold can actually make our bodies produce more brown fat.
So if I spend more time in the cold, I can get better at staying warm.
To some extent, yes. It's called acclimation.
Acclimation. So our bodies are always trying to adapt to our environment, even as adults.
Exactly. And there's also this idea of cold desensitization.
What's that?
It's basically getting used to the cold by exposing yourself to it regularly. Your notes mention this guy, Bertie Bowers, who was on an Antarctic expedition.
Okay, what did he do?
He used to plunge his hands into ice water every day.
Ouch. That sounds painful.
I know, but apparently it helped him get used to the cold.
So there's some truth to that old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Maybe. But let's not forget about the mental challenges of polar environments.
Right. All that darkness and isolation can't be good for your head.
It's really tough.
Yeah.
It can mess with your sleep, your hormones, your energy levels. Even with artificial light and routines, it's hard to maintain a normal rhythm.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
There was this study where they tracked the body clocks of a crew overwintering in Antarctica, and their clocks basically went haywire.
Haywire. What do you mean?
They just started drifting further and further away from a normal 24-hour cycle.
That's scary. It's like their bodies lost track of time.
It really is. And historically, there are a lot of accounts of polar explorers having mental breakdowns.
Yeah, I've heard those stories. It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be. So it's really important to figure out how to stay mentally healthy in those conditions.
So what's the secret? How do you stay sane in a place like that?
Well, your notes talk about a few key strategies. One is having a good sense of community.
Community. So like having good friends and stuff?
Yeah, that's part of it. But it's also about having shared experiences, celebrating milestones, and making sure everyone feels valued.
That makes sense. You need to feel like you belong, like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Exactly. And having things to look forward to is also really important.
Like what?
Like celebrations, special meals, even just having a costume room at a research station can make a difference.
A costume room? Seriously?
Yep. Apparently, even something as simple as that can boost morale and provide a much-needed distraction.
Wow, I never would have thought of that. It's the little things, I guess.
It really is. And of course, respecting personal space is also crucial.
Right. Everyone needs some alone time, especially in a confined environment.
Absolutely. Now, your notes also have this section on rules for working in polar regions.
Rules, like a code of conduct or something.
Kind of.
Yeah.
They're basically practical tips for staying safe and healthy in those extreme conditions.
Okay, like what?
Well, the first one is don't get cold.
That seems pretty obvious.
It is, but it's more about being proactive, like layering your clothes properly, and avoiding getting sweaty because sweat can make you really cold.
Ah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So it's about staying warm but not overheating.
exactly. And then there's don't get hot.
Wait, isn't that the same thing?
It's similar, but it's more about being mindful of your exertion levels. Like, if you're working hard, take breaks to avoid sweating too much.
So it's about pacing yourself.
Yep. And then there's don't get dry.
Dried, you mean like chapped lips?
That's part of it, but it's also about staying hydrated even if you don't feel thirsty.
That's weird. Why wouldn't you feel thirsty in the cold?
I don't know the exact science, but it's something about how your body perceives thirst in cold environments.
Interesting. So you have to force yourself to drink even if you don't feel like it.
Pretty much. And they recommend carrying both hot and cold water.
Why both?
Hot water is good for warming you up, and cold water is better for hydration.
That makes sense. So you've got options.
Exactly. And then there's keep your head in the game.
What's that mean?
It's about maintaining a positive attitude, focusing on the task at hand, and practicing gratitude.
So it's as much about mental strength as physical strength.
Totally. And then there's it takes a village.
Like teamwork.
Yep. It's about looking out for each other, doing buddy checks, and relying on your community for support.
That's a good reminder. You can't do it alone in those kinds of environments.
Definitely not. And then there's think inside the box.
Isn't that usually think outside the box?
I know, it's kind of a play on words, but in this case, it's about focusing on what you can control and avoiding unnecessary risks.
So it's about being practical and not taking unnecessary chances.
Exactly. And finally, there's experts mess up.
What? Experts aren't perfect.
Nope. Everyone makes mistakes, even the most experienced people. So it's important to stay vigilant and value everyone's observations.
That's a good reminder. You can learn something from anyone.
Definitely. So all of these rules basically boil down to three main priorities: safety, the work itself, and well-being.
Safety first, of course. But well-being is really important too.
It's essential, especially for those of us who aren't naturally adapted to polar environments.
Right, we're basically fish out of water up there.
Exactly. So we have to learn from the creatures and people who have figured out how to thrive in those conditions.
It's amazing how resilient life is, isn't it?
It really is. So that's our deep dive into the incredible world of the high Arctic and Antarctic. What do you think? Any aha moments?
Definitely. I mean, the whole thing about antifreeze proteins and how they evolved, that's just mind-blowing. And the fact that humans can adapt to such extreme conditions, both physically and mentally, is pretty inspiring.
It really is. It makes you wonder what humans are capable of, right?
Totally. So I guess the big question is, what can we learn from all this?
That's a good question. What do you think?
Well, I think it shows us that life is incredibly adaptable and resilient, and that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's always a way to find a foothold, to adapt and to thrive. And I think that's a really powerful message, not just for exploring extreme environments, but for facing any kind of challenge in our lives.
That's a beautiful thought. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Until next time, stay curious and maybe keep a warm hat handy.